Hello and welcome to the Fuel, Run, Recover podcast, helping everyday runners fuel better, run smarter, and recover faster so you can reach your full performance potential. I'm your host, Stephanie Natchek, dietitian, fitness coach, and a fellow runner too. As the owner of Stephanie Natchek Performance Nutrition, I've spent the last 10 years helping runners learn to fuel their bodies, level up their running performance, and establish healthier relationships with food and exercise. If you're ready to reconnect with your love of running, then let's get started on today's episode. All right. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Fuel, Run, Recover podcast, where we are talking all about your race tapering, how to navigate those final few weeks before your big race as you get prepared for what hopefully will be a wonderful and successful race day experience. So if you, maybe this happened to you when you were a new runner, or maybe you were following a training plan for the first time for maybe a half marathon or full marathon, you might have been taking a look at your training plan and you were surprised to see that in the final weeks leading up to your actual race, the mileage in your training plan all of a sudden just drops off. You build up, you build up, you build up, and then all of a sudden, the few weeks before the race, you're doing less than you were before, maybe even less than you were at the beginning of the training plan. And so if you're seeing this for the first time, or if you remember seeing this for the first time, you might have been really concerned, really confused, maybe thinking, did my coach miss something? Is this right? Did they get the race date wrong? What's going on here? And so you might find that really confusing or concerning. And, if you're a first time marathoner or half marathoner, you might also be experiencing a lot of nerves and anxiety. And you want to be really, really certain that you're going to be prepared for that race. And so it makes perfect sense that you're going to think to yourself, well, don't I want those extra 3 weeks of training? Like I'm only going to run 20 miles in training and then I'm going to reduce. Like, how do I know I can run a marathon if I didn't run a marathon in training? Now, that's a whole other conversation, but no, typically the vast, vast, vast majority of runners are not going to run the full marathon distance as part of their training. And in fact, some runners, we often talk about that sort of 20-mile long run as being the longest long run of a training cycle. Some runners might only cover, 16 or 18 miles as their longest long run, whereas others, there's longest single long run. Other runners might do a little bit over 20. It depends on how fast of a runner you are and how much time it takes you to cover that 20-mile distance. If you are a runner, sort of going off on a tangent here, but if you are a runner who, over the course of say 3 hours is only going to cover maybe 16 miles or something like that. I couldn't tell you off the top of my head what pace that would be. Then we actually have other strategies to help you get prepared for marathon running rather than just having you be out there running for 5, 6, 7 hours every week as part of your training plan. So if that's you, then definitely, there are some ways that we can not have you spend your entire Saturday every single week out there running for hours and hours on end. Not only is it, a huge time commitment, but also for the most important thing is that our recovery time is so much higher after those big long runs that you're actually better off running more frequently, doing back-to-back longer run days than doing a huge volume all at once because of the increased risk for injury. So anyway, you are looking at your training plan, you are feeling very confused, and what you are looking at is something called your taper. So this strategy of tapering is where we reduce your volume of training or the mileage that you're running in the weeks leading up to your race. And this taper, pre-race taper, has been shown in the research to be a very effective strategy for ultimately boosting race day performance. Now, the benefits, the improvement that we can see in performance can be up to 6%. So it is pretty significant, especially for if you are trying to, say, get a BQ or a PR or whatever it might be, then a 6% improvement in performance just from tapering is pretty great. So this is, that reduction in training volume in sort of the days or weeks leading up to your race. And the benefits of tapering are, there's quite a number of them, but the main ones are that they're going to help you avoid any last minute injuries and help you to both rest up and fuel up and adequately recover when we're going through a training program. We are building up fatigue. We are accumulating fatigue over the weeks of that training plan. That training plan is going to be pushing our limits, right? It's pushing our limits in terms of the volume of running we're doing, the intensity of running we're doing. We are incorporating progressive overload into our training so that we are always pushing our bodies to adapt, to get fitter, to get faster as we go through the weeks of that training plan. And so, in between each individual workout, we are going to be getting slightly less recovered as we increase the volume, increase the intensity compared to earlier on in the training program, right? Maybe we've added some days of training, so we're not getting quite as much recovery in between workouts. We've added some extra volume, added some extra intensity, added maybe, hopefully, more strength training, all of these things. So we're not getting 100% complete recovery in between each of these workouts. And so what you will probably find, what you might find is that as you go through getting into those final weeks of your training plan, you're getting into longer long runs, you're getting into longer, harder speed sessions, less recovery maybe in between your intervals. Your legs might not feel quite as fresh. You might find that you need more sleep. You're feeling a little bit more tired. You might have less energy for other things in your life. And ultimately, if you're training for a marathon, you probably have a lot less time in your life for other things too. So we want to avoid getting into overtraining territory, absolutely. But a well-planned training program is going to challenge us, right? It is going to force us to get fitter, to get faster, to get stronger. And if we are kind of just breezing through a training plan and we are not feeling challenged at all, then, we might be leaving some performance on the table here. So it's always that balance, and there's a real art to this whole thing because, one training plan that works for one runner won't work for the next runner. The same training plan that you followed 5 years ago isn't necessarily going to be the right training plan for you now. So it's always a little bit fluid and it can feel like a little bit of a moving target to really nail things down as you go through. But what's important is to make sure that you're keeping your training plan and your programming flexible and modifiable so that when you need to make adjustments, you can, rather than having this, set in stone training program that if you don't follow it perfectly, you just quit, or making something that's just so far beyond what your capacity, what your abilities are. It should be able to kind of move and grow and be flexible with you. So the question that a lot of runners have is, well, in those last 3 weeks leading up to my marathon, couldn't I continue to build fitness? Like if I kept training for these last 3 weeks, then wouldn't it be beneficial to squeeze as much fitness, squeeze as much performance out of these last few weeks as possible? And if you're a newer runner, especially if you're a newer runner, then yes, technically those extra couple weeks of training, you could continue to see improvements in your fitness. And like I said, this is especially true if you're a newer runner. Yes. However, because of this cumulative fatigue that you're experiencing as the weeks go on, the benefit of tapering far outweighs the additional fitness, but additional fatigue that you would build up if you continued to just train right through to the race. So that's kind of where, yes, maybe there is a little bit of an opportunity to see more fitness if you trained for a final 3 weeks. However, you're definitely putting yourself into that injury territory. You are not going to be completely recovered and fueled. And there's a number of physiological adaptations that take place during our taper. For example, an increase in blood volume, an increase in hemoglobin, which is the the protein that actually transports oxygen around the body. So we want to have enough and lots of hemoglobin to optimize our performance. We see reductions in cortisol and something called creatine kinase, which is a marker of muscle damage after exercise. We see a reduction in rate of perceived exertion, so how hard we feel we're working. So all of these things ultimately are beneficial physiological adaptations and changes that we see during a pre-race taper. So while there maybe is an opportunity to see some benefits if we continue to train right through, the trade-off and the performance benefit that we get from tapering is far going to outweigh any improvement we might see in performance if we continue to train and just, took up those last 3 weeks. Training adaptations take time. And so the short taper before the race is giving us more, say, bang for our buck, more benefit than the other way around. So when should you taper? Like, what races should you taper for? And really, it's a good idea to taper before pretty much all of the races that are goal races for you. So if you have a specific performance goal in mind, maybe it's a PR, maybe it's not, but if you've got a specific goal race, then tapering is always going to be a good idea, because why not take the opportunity to boost your performance without having to do anything? It's sort of the easiest performance enhancer out there is just doing a little bit less. And that's wonderful. Now, when would you consider maybe not tapering? Like, you don't always have to taper before every single race that you do. And one of the instances where I probably wouldn't include a taper for a runner would be if you're running races within your training plan, building up towards another goal race. So for example, if you're training for a full marathon and you have 10Ks or maybe a half marathon that you're going to be running as part of that training, then I wouldn't do a full taper, like a several week taper leading up to those races, because it's going to detract from your ultimate goal of getting ready to run that marathon. Now, it might make sense to do, say, a deload week or a reduction in volume the week leading up to those races. So you're a little bit fresher. Maybe you've taken an extra rest day or, reduced your volume or something like that in that week leading up to that race. But to do a full, 2 or 3 week taper before a half marathon in the context of a marathon training cycle, you might ultimately end up missing out on some of the training, some of the volume that you ultimately needed to do to get ready for that marathon. Now, you don't need to do a full taper. I probably wouldn't do like a big long run or a heavy speed workout the day before, but maybe you're going to just take the day off before or take an extra rest day that week. The other time that you maybe would consider not tapering would be if, something came up and you missed some of your training as you were going through that cycle and you really ultimately can use that extra time. I still would do I would just maybe shorten the taper. I wouldn't do like maybe a full 3 weeks or something like that. Maybe you were just going to shorten it to like 1 week or something and take advantage of those extra 2 weeks of training. So again, just like our training plan needs to be flexible and kind of move with us and depends on what's happening in your life with your training, with injuries and all that kind of stuff, we also want our taper to be flexible and kind of move with us as well. So a few tips for tapering. The first big one is that we want to reduce our total volume or total mileage that we're running, but maintain our intensity. This is really important because a lot of times when people are thinking about tapering, it's like, okay, well, do I just drop my speed work? Like if we're talking about getting more recovery, getting more rest, not adding extra stress and stuff like that to our bodies during this time, it kind of makes sense. It makes logical sense that we would drop our speed sessions and just do easy running. But what's very, very interesting in the research, it was shown that by reducing intensity, we don't get the same improvements in performance on race day. So by keeping the intensity, but just dropping the volume or the frequency, we actually see better results from that pre-race taper. So what that means is that you're going to keep your speed sessions or whether that's like a tempo run or intervals or lactate threshold run, whatever it might be, you're going to just do less. So maybe it's less intervals. Maybe it's shorter intervals. Maybe it's a shorter tempo run. You're dropping the volume, but you're keeping the intensity. Overall, we're looking at about a 40 to 60% reduction in total training volume. So basically dropping your total training volume by about half over the course of that taper. You might also want to reduce the frequency of training by a little bit. So, like dropping maybe one run from your training plan. Or you might want to keep the frequency, but just drop the volume on those days. There is a ton of gray area here because these are things that are very challenging to research because all of us are unique individuals. So some people find that they want to reduce the frequency of training but maintain the volume that they're running on those days. Other people might want to keep running more often but just do shorter workouts on those same days. You will probably have to play around with things, figure out what works best for you, and just go from not only person to person, but also race to race. And this is the thing is that, throughout each race cycle, things are going to go differently. So if you did a taper one way last time and it went well, fantastic. I would use that as my structure for my next taper. But if things didn't go well, or maybe you're running a distance for the first time, or maybe you haven't run or raced that distance in quite a long time, everything is different this time around, then, leave yourself open to maybe tapering a bit differently because personal preference and experience and, keeping things flexible is a huge part of optimizing how this goes for you, both mentally and physically. And this goes too with how long you should be tapering for. The optimal range of tapering can be anywhere between 4 and 28 days. This is a huge range, right? 4 days up to 4 weeks. Like that's nuts, And how do we give recommendations? Because a lot of it's going to depend on the length of your race. So the longer the race, generally the longer the taper is going to be, your fitness and experience and how fast you recover. If you're someone who does tend to recover between workouts rather quickly, you may be better off with a shorter taper versus someone who needs a little bit more time. How you're feeling as you get to those peak mileage weeks in your training plan. So when you're getting up to those biggest, longest, hardest weeks of training, how are you feeling? Are you feeling really good, really energized? Your sleep is great. Your nutrition is great. Like you're honestly doing really well. Then maybe a little bit of a shorter taper is okay. But if you're starting to feel really run down, that fatigue is really starting to catch up with you, you're getting within injury range, then you might be better off, stopping a little bit earlier and doing a little bit of a longer taper so you can optimize your recovery and get ready for that race. So there's a big range and it depends on a lot of factors, but just know that doing some amount of tapering is probably going to be better than no taper at all. So if you had, your training cycle didn't go super well, you missed workouts, maybe you were sick or injured or something like that, and you're thinking to yourself, maybe I should just skip my taper entirely and just build right up to this race. I'm not saying that would never be okay, but even if you just did like a few days or a week for your taper leading up to that race, you are probably going to be better off than if you spend those last 2 or 3 weeks just, building up mileage as much as you can straight up towards that. Now, a lot of people wonder about what to do with their cross training or strength training during their taper. So, if you're someone who does a lot of cross training, then it's okay to keep some of your cross training. But again, we want to reduce our total volume or mileage, not just the running volume or mileage. We're looking for adequate and complete recovery and to get those physiological adaptations that take place during tapering. So if all we're doing is replacing our running volume and mileage with cross training running and mileage, we're not actually tapering. So just keep that in mind that if you're thinking, oh, well, now instead of my run, I'm going to go do a bike workout or a swim workout or an Orange Theory workout, or I'm going to go to my CrossFit class, or I'm going to do all these other things instead of running. That's not quite what tapering is. And so just remember that we want to reduce our overall volume, our total volume mileage, not just the running. Same goes with strength training. Some runners might think to themselves, oh, well, you know what? Now I'm not running as much. So these last couple of weeks is a great time to cram in some extra strength training and make sure that I'm really focused on that in the 3 weeks leading up to my race. Not quite. Because the adaptations from strength training take time, just like any other adaptations we get from training, but because strength training takes many, many weeks and months to actually build, if you were to do a bunch of extra strength training in just those couple weeks before your race, you're probably going to wind up more sore and less recovered than if you just didn't do that. So your strength training should also undergo the same reduction during your taper. And for my clients, I generally will remove the strength training workouts 10 days, maybe 2 weeks before the actual race. So usually not a full 3 weeks out. I'll usually keep it for the first week of the taper, but then it'll be like 2 weeks or maybe 10 days out. We'll remove the strength training. Typically in those slots in a training program, those are going to be rest days. And those are days that we're going to take as rest days instead to recover. So not days that we're filling up with other activities or cross training or more running, but rest days. And this brings me to the next thing that I wanted to talk about, which is the mental game of tapering. Some of my clients love tapering. They feel so good when they sort of get over that hump of that last big long run. They've done the work. I don't know if this is a saying where you're from, but where I'm from, we say the hay is in the barn. And what we mean by the hay is in the barn is like, it's over, it's done, the work is done, there's nothing else you can do at this point in time. Now you're kind of just coasting towards that race day with more free time and the knowledge that you've done everything you can and you're just getting ready to go. And I love that for my runners who feel so good when they start their taper. They're just so excited to like be over that hump of the big long runs. They feel mentally energized. They feel ready. The short runs feel so good and so easy and so quick. It's like, oh my gosh, I only have to run 10 miles today. They love that. And I love that for them. But I have a lot of other runners who have a really hard time with tapering mentally. They feel like they're full of nervous energy. They feel like they don't know what to do with all of that free time. They don't like that they're not running. They're concerned about losing fitness, wishing they had more opportunities or more time to do one last long run. And I will say, especially if the training cycle didn't go super well, or if the last couple of long runs didn't go super well, if the training cycle itself left a runner feeling very anxious or crappy, or, like they're sort of like left wanting in some ways, then that's an area where some people might struggle during the taper wanting to do more. Now, there might be a time if you plan for a 3-week taper, maybe that's an opportunity to shift and do, say, a 2-week taper instead. Maybe there is an opportunity to add in a couple more workouts, have another chance at that long run, that sort of thing. But it would only be if we still feel like there is something left on the table fitness wise, because something happened during that training cycle that we didn't quite hit the volume or hit the workouts that we wanted to. Most of the time, if the training cycle, if we followed the plan, if we did everything, it all went okay, this is just a mental game. And, we all have different personalities and people struggle with different things as runners. And so this is a really good time to focus on those mental race strategies, that race preparation. Maybe you're going to spend more time making your race day plan. Maybe you're going to get a little bit of extra sleep. Maybe you're going to go for a walk instead of a run. Active recovery, keeping things very low key, very easy, not swapping out the running for a lot of high intensity work, but just, keeping it really, really low and active recovery only. Maybe you're going to spend some time meal prepping. Maybe you're going to spend some time, doing other things around the house, taking on some projects. Nothing like really hard. I don't want you moving houses or something and having to move boxes for 3 days straight or anything like that during your taper. But just, doing some other things, filling up your mind, filling up your energy with other activities. So tapering is very much physical in the sense that there are physical changes and adaptations that are taking place that are helping us boost race day performance. But on the other hand, just like everything in running, there's the mental game of tapering that we want to be prepared for, and we want to be ready for that. If and when those feelings hit, we are expecting them, we're ready for them, and we know how to manage them. So that is your tapering 101. I hope that you found this episode helpful to understand what tapering is all about, why we use it as a race day strategy, what are the benefits, what are some of the techniques and tips and tricks and things that we can do to have a great effective taper that sets us up for race day success. If you are looking for some help getting ready for an upcoming race, whether you're looking at running your very first 5K, maybe your first half marathon, or maybe you have a ton of race experience, but you just want to figure out how to do this properly and figure out what is the right way for me to train. How can I focus on my nutrition? Maybe you want to optimize or improve your body composition as a runner. Then I would love to help you get ready for your upcoming races throughout the rest of this year. You can find out more details about how to work with me either one-on-one or in my online program, the Fuel Train Recover Club. You can get the details about both of those at the link in the show notes or by visiting my website, www.stephanienadchuk.com. That is all for this week. I want to thank you so much for tuning in and checking out this episode all about tapering. And we will see you right back here next week for another all new episode. Bye for now. The information on this podcast is for educational purposes only and is not to be used or relied upon for the diagnosis or treatment of any health condition. This information does not create a client-practitioner relationship and should not be used as a substitute for professional medical advice.